You're tired, not just long day at the office, tired, but medieval tired. You've been hauling buckets of questionable water, dodging plagues, and trying not to anger your landlord, who is also your local baron. So, yes, you're exhausted, but when you finally get to bed, you don't lie down. Instead, you prop yourself up against the wall, or maybe a wooden headboard or a pile of hay wrapped in cloth, stacked just high enough to keep your torso raised. Flat sleeping? That's for corpses. Seriously, back then lying down was basically a dress rehearsal for dying. People feared that if they were found flat on their backs, eyes closed and unresponsive, some well-meaning relative might start planning the funeral before breakfast. In a world where doctors treated leeches with more leeches, this wasn't entirely paranoia. Your bed isn't like modern ones either. For one thing, it's short, almost comically so. That's not because medieval people were all hobbit-sized, but because they designed beds for sitting and reclining, not full sprawl-outs. The upright posture supposedly helped digestion, eased breathing, and made it harder for demons to climb into your mouth while you slept, which, yes, was an actual concern. Oh, and forget plush pillows. You might have one, if you were rich. But even then, it's more like a decorative weapon than a comfort item. If you're poor, your pillow might just be your arm, or a wooden block with a prayer carved into it. Sleep tight. So, there you are, wrapped in wool, head tilted awkwardly, knees bent, listening to rats under the floorboards and your cousin snores from 3 feet away. But you don't complain. You're not lying flat, which means you're not dead. Yet. And that's good enough. There's a certain kind of fear that comes not from monsters, but from your own neighbors. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to wake up at your own funeral. In medieval Europe, this wasn't just a bad dream. It was a genuine concern. People didn't trust sleep, and they definitely didn't trust that their sleeping relatives were still among the living. Medical knowledge at the time was, let's say, optimistic. If you stopped moving, breathing softly, and had a weak pulse, congratulations, you were probably declared dead before lunch. There are real recorded cases of people being buried alive, only to wake up underground. That's a very different kind of alarm clock. So, what did people do to avoid this kind of misunderstanding? They sat up, or at least they reclined at such an angle that no one would mistake them for a lifeless body. A flat sleeper was just too corpse-like, pale, still, and horizontal. The more upright you were, the more alive you looked. It was visual insurance. And it wasn't just about safety. There was also symbolism. Death was associated with lying down, just like the dead Christ in a tomb, or saints in paintings, arms folded neatly across the chest. By contrast, to sit upright was to embody vigilance, spiritual alertness, and readiness for resurrection, or breakfast. The plague, of course, didn't help. In times of mass death, people got a little jumpy about anyone who wasn't moving enough. During the Black Death, if you were too still, someone might cover you in a sheet and add you to the wagon before you could say, wait. This fear seeped into culture, architecture, even bedtime rituals. People designed beds that discouraged full-body relaxation. Some literally couldn't be laid flat in. You weren't meant to relax like we do now. You were meant to rest in a state of semi-alert survival. So, next time you lie down, flat in your cozy, warm, memory foam bed, remember, you're doing something they once thought was a little too close to dying. Dinner didn't exactly sit well back then. And that's not just a figure of speech. If you were lucky enough to eat a full meal in medieval Europe, chances are it was loaded with dense bread, heavy meats, fermented things you didn't ask too many questions about, and maybe a side of turnips for flair. Digestion, that was between you and divine intervention. Now, imagine trying to sleep after that. Lying flat after consuming half a pig and a dubious pint of ale was a recipe for medieval heartburn, though they didn't call it that. They called it humors out of balance, or simply the devil in your stomach. Not ideal bedtime vibes. Enter the solution. Sleep sitting up. Propping yourself at an angle was the medieval equivalent of antacid tablets. They didn't understand acid reflux as we do today, but they absolutely understood the consequences of sleeping flat after a greasy late supper. Burping, gasping, choking. All very unpleasant ways to wake up, or worse, not wake up. Even medical texts from the time recommended sleeping with your torso elevated to encourage proper flow and prevent rising vapors. Doctors thought gases from your food could float up into your brain while you slept. And to be fair, After drinking spoiled wine and eating undercooked meat, maybe that wasn't completely wrong. Some noble households even had angled bed frames built specifically for post-feast recovery. You'd recline like a half-melted statue, stuffed to the gills, hoping your digestive system didn't revolt overnight. The poor, on the other hand, just leaned against the nearest beam, knees curled up, hoping they didn't choke on their own bile in the straw. In many ways, medieval people were ahead of their time. Today, doctors tell people with GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, to elevate the head of the bed by 6 inches. Back then, they were doing that instinctively, fueled by roast boar and fear. So yes, it was gross, and weird, and strangely relatable, because after a massive holiday meal, don't we all just want to sit on the couch and not move for 3 hours? Medieval folks did that. They just called it bed. So, let's say you're wealthy, not buy a castle wealthy, more like own 2 goats and a decent fireplace wealthy. You want better sleep, but not the lying down kind. That's still too corpse-like, too reflux-inducing, too vulnerable. What you need is a night chair. Yes, that was a thing. The night chair was exactly what it sounds like. A specially made piece of furniture designed for sleeping upright. Imagine a cross between a throne, a confession booth, and a dentist's chair, upholstered, if you were lucky, in something slightly softer than stone. It supported your back, neck, arms, and sometimes even had a semi-wraparound structure to keep your body from tipping over. Sleep with structure. It wasn't just for comfort. The design was intentional, to help you sit for long periods without collapsing. Think of it like medieval ergonomic design, except instead of preventing carpal tunnel, it kept your soul from slipping into eternal rest prematurely. Royalty and clergy used them often, particularly those recovering from illness, stomach trouble, or just too many courses at dinner. Some chairs even had built-in compartments for warming stones, herbs, and we're not kidding, small containers for nighttime emergencies. Nothing says luxury like relieving yourself without standing up. Even more interesting, some people were buried in chairs, literal wooden seats carved like a mini throne, body placed upright, arms folded, head tilted forward, forever looking like they were just resting. These burials reflected the belief that one should stay watchful even in death, or maybe that you just couldn't trust gravity. Historians still debate whether these chairs were widely used or more symbolic. Some argue they were reserved for the elite. Others believe sleeping upright was common enough that makeshift sleeping chairs existed even in peasant homes, just not as fancy. And yes, today we'd probably just call this whole setup a recliner. But back then, it was a mark of both piety and practicality. You weren't just lounging. You were sleeping like a God-fearing, digestion-aware member of society. So, the next time you dose off in a chair while watching TV, know this. You've joined a centuries-old tradition of vertical snoozing. Ah, France, land of wine, cathedrals, philosophical sighs. And apparently, sleeping while shaped like the number 7. During the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, many French nobles and aristocrats adopted the proud tradition of sleeping bolt upright, almost like they were being punished for being fancy. Why? Well, first of all, it looked good. Upright posture was associated with discipline, strength, and class. Even in sleep, a nobleman wasn't supposed to sprawl out like a common farmer in a haystack. No, he rested as if he were halfway through an important speech, dignified, rigid, probably uncomfortable. Portraits from this era often show people half reclined, elbows angled just so, neck propped perfectly. These weren't paintings of people sitting. They were painting how they slept, or, at least, how they wanted to be remembered sleeping, stylishly upright, like someone who dreams in Latin. Some noble homes even had custom beds designed not for lying flat, but for reclining at a fixed incline, like a chaise lounge wearing a cape. Mattresses were layered at the head, sometimes with wooden wedges underneath, to enforce that upright elegance. You could call it passive-aggressive gravity. And of course, there were medical reasons too. French physicians of the time believed upright sleep helped prevent bad humors from settling in the chest, which was doctor speak for, we don't know what lungs are, but keep them high. They also believed vertical sleep aided circulation, digestion, and kept the soul from wandering too far during the night. Culturally, sleeping upright also signaled moral superiority. Laziness was a sin, full-body relaxation was indulgent. Being constantly a little uncomfortable, That was classy. Historians still argue whether this was truly widespread, or just a fashionable phase among the elite. But writings from travelers and domestic records suggest it was common enough to be noticed, and mimicked, by those hoping to climb the social ladder, while sitting up straight in bed. So, yes, in France, sitting down was the new lying down, and if your neck hurt, that just meant you were sleeping with style. Let's talk pillows. You may think of them as soft, squishy rectangles that cradle your head while you dream about being late to class in your underwear. But in medieval and early modern Europe, pillows were anything but casual. They were status symbols, decorative flexes, and sometimes literal pain in the neck. If you were poor, your pillow was likely your arm, a sack of straw, or a folded-up piece of rough cloth that smelled suspiciously like cabbage. Comfort wasn't the point. Survival was. You just needed something to keep your head off the cold floor and your dignity intact. But if you were wealthy, then you had bolsters, neck rolls, embroidered head supports, and sometimes even carved wooden frames meant to elevate your entire upper body. Pillows weren't just functional. They were weapons of class warfare. The more ridiculous and elaborate, the better. Some pillows were stuffed with down, others with horsehair, and some were packed so tightly that using them felt like resting your head on a reluctant loaf of stale bread. These pillows weren't designed for sinking into. They were there to prop, pose, and project power. In noble bedrooms, pillows were often color-coded, embroidered with initials, or blessed by clergy. That's right, your pillow might come with a prayer, a curse, or the lingering scent of sanctified herbs. Sleep well, under surveillance. Even more fascinating, there were rules. In some households, only certain family members or guests of a certain rank were allowed to use the elevated pillows. Others got the flat ones, or none. Using the wrong pillow could be a subtle insult, or a serious faux pas. Nothing says "I don't respect you" like handing someone the thin one that smells like goat. Historians still debate how widespread these customs were, but artifacts, estate records, and even wills mention pillows as prized possessions. Some were passed down like heirlooms, while others were burned after death, for hygiene and probably psychological reasons. So next time you fluff your 5 memory foam pillow from the discount bin, know this. You're resting your head where the rich once waged soft, silent battles for social dominance. And maybe, just maybe, you're winning. You finally settle into your slightly too upright bed, proud of your stiff neck and aggressively symbolic pillow. But before you drift off, someone else climbs in next to you, and then another, and maybe one more. Welcome to pre-modern bed sharing, where personal space went to die. In medieval and early modern Europe, sharing a bed was the norm, not the exception. Entire families slept in one bed, sometimes even with servants, strangers, or overnight travelers. It wasn't scandalous. It was economical, practical, and weirdly communal. Beds were expensive, heat was scarce, and rooms were few. The solution? Just pile in. You, your spouse, your kids, your apprentice, your neighbor's cousin passing through town, all in the same bed. And yes, sometimes sitting up, propped against walls, shoulders bumping, knees touching, pretending this was fine. Even in inns, the concept of getting your own room was laughable. You paid for a space in a bed, not the whole thing. You might arrive at night and be assigned to lie next to a complete stranger who had already been sleeping for hours. If you're lucky, he didn't snore. If you're unlucky, he didn't stop talking about his goat. Etiquette books from the time included advice on bed behavior, like how to sleep politely next to someone you don't know, how much talking is too much talking, and when farting is socially unacceptable. Answer: never. Royalty weren't exempt. Even kings shared beds, though mostly for symbolic reasons. Having important guests sleep beside you was a show of trust, intimacy, or political alliance. Nothing says peace treaty like synchronized snoring. The idea of sleeping alone in silence would have seemed alien, maybe even dangerous. Alone meant vulnerable. Together meant warm, safe, and statistically less likely to be eaten by wolves or suffocate from poor ventilation. Historians still argue whether this practice was universal or varied by region and class. But we know this. Bed sharing wasn't weird. It was life. Cold, crowded, probably smelly. But life. So if you're listening to this while lying alone in your climate-controlled room, wrapped in memory foam and silence, congratulations. You're sleeping like a king, a very lucky, very solitary king. Of course, the church had opinions about how people slept. In medieval Europe, if you did it, said it, ate it, or dreamed it, chances are the church had a theological position on it. And sleeping positions? Oh yes, that too. For starters, lying flat on your back was associated with death, laziness, and sinful indulgence. It was the posture of the dead Christ, martyrs, and the morally compromised. Sleeping upright, on the other hand, symbolized vigilance, the soul staying half awake, ready for prayer, repentance, or the apocalypse. You know, just in case. Monks often slept in communal dormitories, fully clothed, on inclined wooden boards or minimal straw. Not because they lacked comfort, but because comfort was suspicious. The holier you were, the worse your mattress. Some even slept sitting up by choice, to imitate the suffering of saints or to make it harder to fall into dreams full of temptation. Practical? No. Holy, allegedly. Even the timing of sleep was spiritual. Many monks woke at midnight for matins, a pre-dawn prayer hour, breaking the night into chunks. This interrupted sleep was believed to keep the soul from drifting too far, and also, let's be honest, probably limited nightmares about sins you hadn't confessed yet. Lay people were also encouraged to sleep modestly, not just in how much space they took up, but in what they wore, where they faced, and what they thought about as they drifted off. Were you imagining heaven, or something sweatier? The church also connected sleep posture with moral posture. Sleeping on your side? Fine. Curled up like a baby? Acceptable. Sprawled out like a lounging Roman demigod? That could invite demons, and not the fun ones. Even dreams were under surveillance. A vivid or impure dream wasn't just random brain static. It might be a message, a test, or a sign that you'd been spiritually sloppy. Better tighten your belt, literally. Some monks wore hair shirts or ropes to bed, just to keep things appropriately unpleasant. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were enforced, or whether most people quietly ignored them. But we do know this. Even in sleep, medieval souls were never fully off duty. If you thought your IKEA bed was dramatic, let's take a moment to appreciate medieval and early modern coffin-shaped beds. Yes, really. These weren't just cozy rectangles for sleeping. Some of them were borderline death rehearsal chambers, complete with heavy wooden sides, canopy tops, and enough enclosed space to make even a vampire claustrophobic. The idea wasn't to be spooky. It was practical and symbolic. In cold stone houses with no insulation, box beds trapped body heat. Closing curtains around the frame helped keep out drafts, rats, and occasionally wandering relatives. But it also made your sleeping space look eerily like, well, a coffin, and that wasn't lost on anyone. Sleeping in a closed-off box reminded people of memento mori. Remember, you will die. Every night you crawled into something that resembled your eventual resting place. It was a quiet, creepy reminder to live virtuously, or at least wash your soul before lights out. Some even referred to their beds as deathbeds, especially as they aged, not because they were being dramatic, but because they expected to die in them. In fact, many wills from the time list the bed as a major item of inheritance. Your great-grandfather may have been born, married, and died in the same piece of furniture, possibly upright. And then there were curtains, not optional. Bed curtains were so common they became a design feature. In fancier homes, they were embroidered, tasseled, sometimes even scented. But for the average sleeper, they were just another barrier between you and the freezing night, or the prying eyes of roommates, neighbors, or that guy who insisted on sleeping sitting up and staring at everyone. Some curtain rods were built into the bed frame itself, thick wooden beams from which hung layers of cloth. These helped simulate privacy, block light from communal fireplaces, and gave the illusion that your corner of the shared bedroom was a sacred sleep zone. Emphasis on illusion. Historians still debate how much psychological impact these coffin beds had. But even if no one admitted it aloud, you had to wonder, did crawling into a box each night, pulling shut the curtains, and going stiff as a board ever make anyone just a little nervous? Probably, which is why most of them slept sitting up. You may think your bedtime routine is a bit much. Special pajamas, blackout curtains, a meditation app whispering about ocean waves. But compared to people a few centuries ago, you're practically minimalist. because when it came to sleepwear, they went all in. Let's start with the nightcap. Not the drink, though that came later, but the actual cap. Picture a soft, sometimes conical, fabric hat tied under the chin like a sleepy wizard. It wasn't for fashion. Homes were cold, insulation was fantasy, and heat escaped fastest through your head. So, wrapping your skull in wool was less about style and more about basic survival. Then came the nose cover. Yes, really. These were strips of cloth or specially sewn flaps designed to wrap over your nose while you slept. Why? Because cold air up the nostrils was thought to cause illness, nightmares, or even soul leakage. Can't have that happening before breakfast. And let's not forget the sleep mask. Not the silk spa kind, but heavy fabric panels or even leather flaps tied around the eyes. Some were perfumed to calm the humors. Others were blessed. Some were just opaque barriers to keep out moonlight, firelight, or the gaze of the stranger sleeping 2 feet from your face. Thanks, bed sharing. Layered clothing was common too. Long woolen nightshirts, thick socks, and sometimes even gloves were worn to bed. Not to be cute, but to survive the night without frostbite. And if you were particularly devoted or paranoid, you might also sleep with a small charm, a religious token, or even a knife. You know, just in case. Of course, wealth changed the game. The rich had embroidered sleepwear, scented oils, and elaborate dressing down rituals. But even the poor did their best, often sleeping in whatever they'd worn that day, possibly adding an extra layer of night rags just for warmth. Historians still argue whether some of these accessories were truly widespread or exaggerated in records, but we know this. Sleep wasn't just unconscious time. It was a vulnerable state, and people dressed for it like they were preparing for battle, with cold air, bad dreams, and judgmental roommates. So next time you toss on a t-shirt and slide under your duvet, remember, your ancestors went to bed like they were entering the Arctic, with demons. Sleep and death have always been cousins, the kind that look suspiciously alike at family reunions. And throughout history, people leaned into that resemblance hard. In paintings, poems, and philosophical rambles, sleep wasn't just rest. It was a temporary rehearsal for the big one. In classical art, sleep is often depicted with closed eyes, draped limbs, and pale skin. Basically, a warm-up corpse. The Greeks even gave us the literal family tree. Hypnos, the god of sleep, was the twin brother of Thanatos, the god of death. Talk about awkward bunk beds. This connection stuck through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. Artists painted sleeping figures with eerily peaceful expressions, arms folded, mouths slightly open, like they were halfway to sainthood, or 6 feet under. Saints were often shown sleeping in death, while everyday people were painted sleeping as if death had just stepped out to grab something. Writers weren't subtle either. Shakespeare called sleep the death of each day's life, and every other medieval poem treated a nap like a spiritual cliffhanger. Some medical texts even described sleep as a small death, where the soul wandered briefly before returning, if it chose to. This wasn't just metaphor. People feared that deep sleep could turn into permanent sleep without warning, especially after a heavy meal, a fever, or one too many sins. That's why sitting up to sleep wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. You weren't totally surrendered. You were still alert, kind of, ready to snap back into life, if necessary. Dreams also blurred the line. In some cultures, dreams were visits to the afterlife, divine messages, or even previews of your own demise. Sleeping flat made you too open to those messages, while upright sleep kept the soul tethered like a balloon you weren't quite ready to release. Historians still debate how literally people took these associations, but the cultural artifacts, the paintings, the prayers, the bedtime rituals, all point to a world where every night's sleep was just a dress rehearsal for something more permanent. So the next time someone tells you, sleep like the dead, maybe don't. So let's pretend for a moment that medieval people had access to a sleep lab. Would their upright, semi-conscious bedtime rituals have gotten a thumbs up from modern scientists? Well, kind of. But also, no, but also, maybe. Today we know that sleeping slightly elevated can actually help in certain situations. People with acid reflux, sleep apnea, or sinus issues are often told by doctors to prop up their upper bodies. Even NASA has studied inclined sleeping to mimic how astronauts rest in low gravity. So, yes, the old-timers were onto something. Even if they couldn't spell esophagus, sleeping at a 15 to 30 degree incline can reduce snoring, improve breathing, and prevent those awful "why am I drowning on dry land" moments at 2 a.m. So, when medieval folks propped themselves up with hay, pillows, or carved wood, they may have been solving real problems with practical, if uncomfortable, solutions. But don't get too cozy with the past. A lot of the reasoning behind upright sleeping was less scientific. Medical theories back then centered around the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which honestly sounds more like Hogwarts house names than health science. The idea was that lying flat caused these fluids to settle incorrectly in the body, making you sick, melancholic, or just weird. Others believed that sleeping flat made you vulnerable to spiritual invasion, allowing evil spirits, bad dreams, or wandering souls to enter your body. No clinical trials on that, unfortunately. Historians still argue how much of the upright sleeping trend was based on real health effects versus pure superstition. The answer is probably both. When your entire world smelled like livestock and fermented cabbage, any sleep that didn't kill you was a win. Interestingly, some doctors in the 1700s and 1800s kept the tradition alive, recommending upright sleep for everything from asthma to heartbreak. The science on heartbreak is still pending. So, yes, while we now have adjustable beds and white noise machines, the essence remains. Sit up just a little, breathe easier, and hope that nothing ghostly crawls up your nose during the night, which again was an actual concern back then. At some point, humanity collectively decided, you know what, let's just lie down, and thus began the long, quiet revolution that brought us from upright, dozing to the glorious sprawl of modern sleep. But it didn't happen overnight, ironically. The shift from sitting up sleep to horizontal lounging began slowly, driven by a mix of technology, medicine, and mattress envy. As homes became warmer, beds became bigger, and medical knowledge slightly less medieval, people realized maybe it's okay to lie flat and not immediately die or be possessed. In the 17th and 18th centuries, beds themselves began to change. They got longer, wider, less coffiny. Feather mattresses replaced straw, spring frames entered the chat, and people started thinking, maybe I don't need to prop myself up like I'm about to deliver a sermon. Cleanliness helped too. As hygiene improved, very slowly, fears around bad air, night vapors, and body fluids seeping into shared bedding began to fade. People started associating lying down not with death or disease, but with luxury, softness, privacy. Naps that didn't require core strength. Doctors began recommending side sleeping for health, especially for pregnant women, the elderly, and people with melancholy, which was basically the catch-all for everything from sadness to indigestion. Lying flat became therapeutic instead of terrifying. Meanwhile, literature and art started romanticizing horizontal sleep. No longer was it just dead pose. Now it was sensual, peaceful, intimate. A sign that your home had enough space, your life had enough calm, and your digestion had settled enough to truly let go. Even religious views softened. The church stopped micromanaging pillow angles and became less obsessed with sleep posture. Dreams were still suspect, of course, but how you physically slept, less important. More freedom to flop. Historians still debate exactly when the average person made the switch. For elites, it likely happened in the 1700s. For common folk, maybe a century or two later. But gradually, the bed evolved from a shared, seated survival chamber to the flat, private oasis we know today. So, the next time you belly flop into bed and starfish across the sheets, remember, you're enjoying a hard-won privilege. Your ancestors died, sitting up so you could sleep like a relaxed burrito. So after all this, centuries of upright snoozing, bolstered necks, anti-demon positioning, here's the question. Could you actually sleep sitting up today? And not just on a red-eye flight surrounded by strangers chewing loudly, but every single night? Well, some people already do. Think of recliner sleepers, folks with medical conditions like GERD, sleep apnea, or chronic back pain. They often sleep at an incline and swear by it. Not exactly sitting bolt upright like a 14th century monk, but close enough to make your chiropractor nod in approval. Then there are the airplane sleepers, bus nappers, and people who pass out during Zoom calls with their head at a 45-degree angle. Technically, yes, we still sleep sitting up when we have to. But voluntarily, every night, not so much. Modern comfort has made horizontal sleep the default. Our beds are foam-layered, posture-correcting, temperature-controlled clouds. We expect sleep to be effortless, not a daily battle with gravity. Choosing to sleep upright now feels like choosing to churn your own butter, quaint, noble, unnecessary. But it's not all absurd. Some sleep experts suggest incline sleeping can help with snoring, drainage, and breathing. In fact, there's a whole niche community experimenting with incline bed therapy, where people raise the head of their bed by 6 inches and claim better circulation, fewer headaches, and the vague but satisfying sense of biohacking their way to immortality. Still, it's not for everyone. Sit too upright and you risk back strain, neck cramps, or just feeling like a sad office worker who never left their chair. Plus, unless your bed has been custom built by a medieval carpenter or modern ergonomic wizard, it's going to be weird. Historians still argue whether upright sleeping was more functional or symbolic, and whether we've truly advanced or just gotten floppier. But the truth is, we don't need to sleep like we're waiting for a fire drill anymore. We've earned the horizontal. So, could it work today? Sure, for some. But should it? Only if you miss feeling like a very tired statue. And maybe, just maybe, if your mattress is terrible and your ancestors are watching. The fire's almost out. The last candle flickers like it's unsure whether to keep fighting or just call it a night. You're sitting up, blanket pulled to your chest, spine slightly curved, neck gently tilting forward. It's not exactly comfortable, but it's not meant to be. This is the way sleep worked for centuries. Your head nods once, then again, slowly, rhythmically. You're not fully asleep, but you're not fully here either. Just like them, the monks in stone dormitories, the nobles in curtained beds, the peasants curled by the hearth, all nodding into that strange half-sleep, not quite down, not quite gone. In those days, this moment, the in-between, was sacred. It was when prayers were whispered, when dreams were feared or welcomed, when the soul was believed to hover, cautious and watchful. People believed that to lie flat was to surrender, to risk being mistaken for dead, or worse, to actually become so. But sitting up, that meant you were still trying, still alert, still aware of the line between life and sleep, and determined to stay just on the living side of it. Even now, in hospitals, some patients sleep better inclined. Even now, some people with grief or anxiety prop themselves upright to doze, because too much comfort feels dangerous, because lying down feels like giving in. Historians still argue whether our ancestors truly preferred it this way, or if they just endured what they had. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe they sat up because the world was uncertain, because comfort was rare, because rest, even bad rest, was something you earned, not something you bought on sale during a mattress commercial. And maybe tonight you'll shift in your own bed, just a little. Let your head tilt, your body curl gently forward, as if reenacting a pose that's been practiced for thousands of years, a silent ritual of survival, of slowness, of sitting just long enough before the dream pulls you under. Sleep well, but not too flat.